Welcome once again. We are back for part two of the skeletal system. So let's just go ahead and dive right in, shall we? All right. So the skeletal system. Part two, we are going to talk about what actually makes up the bones. In our last part, in part one, if you missed that, you might want to go check that out. We were talking primarily about just the bones, what they're called, where they are, how many of them there are. Today, we are going to talk more about what makes up the bones and the joints and then various disorders. So let's go ahead and dive right in. As always, though, if you would please click the like and subscribe so I can continue to make content and bring it to you. All right, so let's go ahead and start with bone tissue. So bone tissue is what actually makes up the bone. There are two types of bones, compact and spongy. This is a diagram of compact bone. There is a little bit of spongy off to the side, but we'll address that separately. So what makes up the compact bone and what makes it compact is the fact that everything that makes it up is packed tightly together. So there's not really a whole lot of space in between. The packing together and the compactness of it makes it very, very strong. Okay. And here's what makes it up. So we have what is termed an osteon. This little circular area here is the osteon. Okay. The osteon has down the center of each of them, and notice they're kind of everywhere in here, what's called a central canal. And the central canal is where blood vessels, arteries, veins, and lymphatic vessels run to be able to nourish the bone, to be able to bring it nutrients, and then, of course, take away waste. The lamellae is each of these little squares, well, they're kind of squares, offset squares, that make up the osteon. Okay. And then in between each of these little compact areas of squares are where the osteocytes live. The osteocytes are the actual bone cells. Okay. Again, back to medical terminology, cyte, C-Y-T-E, is cell, osteo is bone, so bone cell. Spongy bone, on the other hand, literally looks like that. It's spongy. It's got spaces. It is very helpful with our bones in lessening the weight of our bones, right? If all our bones were solid, compact bone, our skeleton would be so heavy, it would be really difficult to move. So we have a good portion of each bone is made of spongy bone, surrounded, of course, by compact bone for the strength and the toughness. So these little pores, or however you want to call them, they look like a sponge, right? Are called trabeculae. And in between the trabeculae are spaces that are filled with bone marrow. Bone marrow can be either red or yellow. Red bone marrow each has its own job, and red bone marrow has the job of producing blood cells, while yellow bone marrow is primarily just composed of adipose tissue or fatty tissue. Each, however, supports and nourishes the body as well as the bones. Here's the anatomy of a bone, or what a bone basically looks like, the pieces and parts that make it up. Now, this is a long bone. So not every single bone is going to look like this, but they all basically have the same parts with a couple of differences. So in a long bone, the ends of the bone, the kind of clubby, knobby ends of the bone are called the epiphysis. Okay, so this particular bone would be the proximal epiphysis, and this is the distal epiphysis. Okay. The center, or the kind of long part of the bone in a long bone, is called the diaphysis. Running down the center of the diaphysis is what is called a medullary cavity. This is kind of where there's a lot of spongy bone. The bone marrow lies there. There's what's called a nutrient foramen, and a foramen, of course, is a hole, and that is what allows nutrients to be brought to and from the bone. And then if you notice on the ends, surrounded by compact bone, is spongy bone. Again, this helps to lighten the bone. On the ends of this particular bone, and most long bones, because they articulate with another bone to form a joint, is what we term articular cartilage. Okay, and it's just cartilage that is covering the ends of the bone to allow for it to articulate with another bone and slide, so there isn't that like bone on bone scraping, which would wear the bone down a lot quicker. The outer layer of the bone is called the periosteum, while the inner layer of the bone is called the endosteum. Okay. Up here, which is notable on long bones or any bones that grow, that lengthen, is what is called the epiphyseal line. That is right here. And that's what actually allows for growth. So as a child is growing and becoming taller, so their legs are getting longer, their arms are getting longer, that is where bone is created, extra bone, to lengthen those bones that need to be lengthened to grow. And then once puberty hits, especially in girls, it happens a little quicker than in boys. But once puberty hits, that line starts to seal up. So even as an adult, if you looked at those bones, you would see the line, you would see where it was and where it's sealed. However, it is sealed, there's no more growth happening. In children, you can actually see that line still, separating and growing. This is oftentimes how they, other than size, but this is oftentimes when they find remains that are just bones, they can differentiate between whether it's a child or an adult. Bone formation happens through a process called ossification. Several different things go into ossifying a bone. Osteoblasts are bone forming cells. They actually create the cells that then become bone cells or osteocytes. And then osteoclasts are bone destroying or bone removal cells. So these are what come in and actually destroy cells so that new cells can regenerate. The way I've always remembered that is kind of backwards in my mind. So to me, blast means to destroy. But in this case, blast is actually the bone forming cells. So I just remember that it is backwards. You can figure out your own way to remember these things. Because remember, like I always say, doesn't have to make sense to anybody but you. All right, let's talk a little bit about joints. There are different types of joints, and each type of joint has its own characteristics. Okay, so for instance, a fibrous joint is a joint that's connected by a dense band of tissue and does not allow for movement. So a really good example of this would be a suture in the skull. Those are technically joints because it's two bones coming together, but because they're connected with a really, really dense band of tissue and they're butted up right against each other, they don't move. There's no articulation, okay? Cartilaginous, I have a hard time saying that, joints are joined by a band of cartilage. These have a little bit of slight movement, okay? Not a ton of movement, but slight movement. The most common type of joint in the body is called a synovial joint. They're connected by ligaments. They are separated by a fluid-filled cavity to add some cushion, and they move completely freely. So let's take a look at the different types of synovial joints. There's a plain joint, plane as in Plane, a plane, not I'm plane. This is a joint between two flat surfaces. A good example of that is the carpal bones. The condylar joint is a joint between two oval surfaces. Good example of this are the metacarpals and the phalanges, the joint between those two. A saddle joint is a saddle surface to depression joint. So kind of a joint that looks like this, like a half moon sort of, that goes into a depression. Not ball and socket depression. A good example of this is the joint between the metacarpals and the carpals. A hinge joint is a joint between a cylindrical surface and a depression. So a good example of this is the elbow. A pivot joint is also a joint between a cylindrical surface and a depression, although this allows more for pivoting or rotation. The atlas and the axis of the neck, which are the first two bones of the neck, that allow you to be able to do this. Good example. And then a ball and socket, which is probably the most well-known and most famous type of joint, and that is a round head that fits into a round socket. These made famous by the hip joints. Excuse me. Here is a diagram of a good number of these. So here's that plane joint where you have just two kind of flat areas that move together. Here is that condylar joint where you got the oval on oval, basically. The saddle joint where you have the saddle going into the depression of the same shape. Here is your hinge joint where you have that kind of cylindrical shape that goes into kind of a half moon, half circle, and allows to go one way but not the other. Here is your pivot joint, and then here is your ball and socket. Okay. Here's a lot of the movements that we talk about that have medical terms for them. So I will just kind of run through them fairly quickly. So you have flexion, which is taking something up, flexing. Extension is actually extending out. And then if you extend too far one direction, it is called hyperextension. So here we have flexion going up, extension going out, back, and then hyperextension of the shoulder going all the way back. This is rotation here, but could be also considered flexion, extension, and hyperextension if you look at it from the front. Flexion of the arm up, extension down. Flexion at the waist forward, hyperextension backwards. We have abduction and adduction. So abduction means to move a body part away from the midline, while adduction means to bring it towards the midline. So here is abduction and adduction with the arm, abduction and adduction with the leg. We can take our legs and rotate them either medially, so rotate them in, or a lateral rotation, which is rotating it out. Here is extension, flexion, and hyperextension of the wrist. So flexion down, extension out, and then hyperextension back. Pronation and supination. So pronation, because prone position is face down. That means you're putting your hand this way. Supination is face up, so that is putting the hand this way. I always remember you're carrying soup. Protraction and retraction, this is in the jaw. So protraction means to push out, while retraction means to bring in. And we all hate to do that because then we get a double chin and it's just bad. Elevation versus depression, this is with the shoulders, so elevate, depress. Opposition versus reposition. So opposition, reposition. We have extension and flexion of the leg. Eversion and inversion of the foot. So if you evert, you're taking the side of your foot and turning it out versus inverting, which is taking the other side, the medial side of your foot and bringing it up. And then plantar flexion is down while dorsiflexion is up. Okay. Let's talk about disorders of the joints. So some disorders can be arthritis or arthritic in nature, which is basically just a inflammation of the joint. There's a couple different types of arthritis. There's rheumatoid arthritis and there's osteoarthritis. There's also one called psoriatic arthritis that's brought on by psoriasis. Um, but rheumatoid and osteo are probably the most commonly known, but they are very, very different. So rheumatoid arthritis is actually an autoimmune disorder, meaning that the body is attacking itself and causing the joint inflammation. That can occur really at any age. It doesn't really matter. We always think of, arthritis being more of an older person's disorder, but in reality, rheumatoid arthritis can strike at any age. And then osteoarthritis is more the common arthritis that we think of, where it's just a wearing down of the joint over time, or even in the case of athletes, just, really beating up your joints and causing you to become arthritic a little sooner. Dislocation, of course, is any time a joint becomes displaced from its original position. And this is usually injury, and usually those can be just popped back in. A herniated disc. So in between our vertebral column or our vertebra, there are little pads called discs, intervertebral discs, and those keep our vertebra separated slightly, also provides cushioning and stability. And every so often, those can herniate or actually puff out. So if you had, two discs between each other two vertebra next to each other and a disc in between, sometimes they'll just push out, and that can cause the vertebra to smash together and be bone on bone, and that very painful. And then there's sprains of the joint. Sprain, of course, is when a ligament or a tendon becomes torn or overstretched. A strain is more of a stretch, sprain is more of a tear. Then there are three spinal disorders that all have to do with the location or the characteristics of the spine. Scoliosis, probably the most well-known. That is a lateral curvature of the spine, or where the spine is not straight. It's kind of like an S. I kind of can't do that with my hand, but kyphosis is more of a hunchback disorder where people, I call them the little osteoporosis old ladies with the kyphosis. It's awful, I know, but that's what you see. It's kind of a hunchback. And then lordosis is more of a sway back disorder. So where the spine is more like this is lordosis, this is kyphosis, and then the lateral bit curving is scoliosis. All right. Osteomyelitis is another disorder of the bone. This is generally due to infection of some type. Osteoporosis is a lack of calcium, lack of minerals. It's a softening of the bone. Actually, not softening, more brittle. Softening would be osteomalacia. But osteoporosis affects women more than it does men, and is usually brought on because when women go through menopause, their estrogen production slows way down, and estrogen is actually what helps with fending off osteoporosis. So when we go through those hormonal changes, oftentimes we need more calcium, and vitamin D, because vitamin D helps to absorb calcium and just to kind of keep ourselves in homeostasis. Rickets is a kind of a old disorder of the bones. Not to say it doesn't still happen. I'm sure underdeveloped countries probably still have the issue. But in developed countries such as ours, we don't see rickets much anymore. Rickets is basically due to a lack of calcium and D, and it's a childhood disorder. And again, vitamin D has to be present in order for the body to absorb calcium. So if you're lacking in vitamin D, even if you have plenty of calcium, it's not going to absorb. Versus if you lack in calcium and vitamin D, then you're just not going to have the required amount to keep the bones strong. All right, let's take a look at fractures. So there's various types of fractures. This is what is known as a transverse fracture because it's literally a break just all the way across the bone. This is a linear fracture. A lot of people refer to those as hairline fractures because they don't break the bone completely like in half. It's more of an up and down break. This is an oblique, so diagonal. Oblique means diagonal. Non-displaced, where this is an oblique displaced, so more of what they call a compound fracture, where the bone actually moves apart. This is a spiral fracture. Spiral fractures are usually caused by twisting of the limb where the bone is present. This is a green stick fracture. Notice it is on the side and it is kind of linear, but it doesn't go all the way through. This is very common in children because of the fact that children's bones have not fully developed. They're still somewhat pliable. And so if they do something, have some kind of injury that would cause a normal bone, an adult bone to break, it kind of just starts to break and then bends. So it doesn't break all the way through. So green stick, very common in children. And then this is a comminuted or a crushing type of fracture where literally the bone just disintegrates or explodes into small pieces. All right. So that concludes the skeletal system. I hope that helped you to understand the system a little bit better. That is my aim. So please, 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 again, if you haven't already, like and subscribe to my channel so I can continue to do this for you. I really enjoy it and I hope you do too. And I will see you next time. Take care.